Oh, good. I think it's already 4 o'clock plus, right? So, Flavio, if you want to, Flavio has some bureaucratic announcements first. Then Valter, then you introduce our speaker for today, right? But first, Flavio, if you can go with the announcements.
Yeah. So I think I was thinking that maybe I can just start and then I hand over to Valter, and Valter can do the introduction for Stacie. Okay. So yeah. So welcome to our weekly seminar, research seminar.
You can't even say which one it is, right?
Yeah, I
you
think
it's the fifth, and then you didn't know if it was the 5th or the 6th. Or
I think it's yeah, I don't remember actually. I think it is the 5th, right?
No, I only did that because you told me not to interrupt you today. So this is what I'm not doing.
No, I think it's the 5th seminar, research seminar in information systems, and we are really happy to have Stacie Peter here to present her research in formative constructing information systems. And so the agenda kind of is to start. We have this interaction. I think last week we tried to use Mentimeter for the questions, and we kind of decided to stick with that. And yeah, I sent the link for the participants, and then you can. I will just post here on the chat in a few minutes, right after I hand over the talk to Valter. And then we can post the questions to the speaker, to Stacie, on the Mentimeter. But this doesn't mean that you should not use the chat on Google Meet. You can also interact with the participants on the chat as well. And we kind of motivate you to do it. We have very good discussions on the chat between the participants, and this is another way to improve not only the discussions, but also, okay, should you already share? Not only the discussions, but also the debate on the topics. Okay, so this is really good, and you should not stop to do it. Yeah, so we're gonna use the chat and also the Mentimeter for the questions. Here's the link, but I think Alexander already sent the link.
Yeah, I shared it in the chat here as well.
Okay, perfect. That's really good. So without any further ado, I would hand over the talk to Valter, and he can present Stacie and make the introductions. Thank you. Okay, before I hand over, just I would like to thank Stacie for being here and to make the presentation and to make available this time to give this talk in our seminar, and also Valter for being here as well and make the invitation and make the introduction. It's really good to have you both here just talking about this talk. Thank you very much again. So Valter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Flavio. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everybody else that is here today with us. It's a great honor to introduce to you Professor Stacie Peter. Stacie is one of the leading researchers in the AIS field. She's been the editor-in-chief for the database for advances in information systems, which is one of the best journals we have in our field. I guess Stacie is still at Baylor University, right, Stacie?
That's right.
Yes. And she has been very active in the AIS Association for Information Systems and has published a great number of papers, wonderful papers in different leading journals too. The paper that she's going to talk about today is one of those that influenced me when I was struggling with this concept of formative constructs in my research. So thank you very much for writing it, Stacie. And I guess that's basically what I have to say. Thank you again for
Valter, and only because Flavio always tells me that I'm interrupting everyone, I have to say that we should almost sing happy birthday to this paper today, because during this last week, it achieved its 3,000th citation in Google. So, I mean, I haven't been checking how many citations I've had in my whole career, but if I sum all my papers, I got to get to 3,000, I think. So this is just one paper. So it's a very important paper for our community. Thank you very much, Stacie, for sharing, first for writing the paper, and now for talking about it with us.
Absolutely, glad to. So would I be able to share my screen and share my slides? Perfect. Let's see if I can pick the right thing to get us started. All right. Whoops. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep, it's there.
Okay, So I'm really excited to share this paper today, and it's been a while since I've actually presented this paper formally. It's getting to be an older paper. I refer to it kind of as one of my classics because it was published back in 2007, but it has been a paper that helped kind of establish some of my credentials in the field and knowledge in the field, so I'm very grateful to have been able to be a part of this project and to be able to share it with you today. I know that we have both faculty and students on the call, and so one thing that I try to share anytime I present this paper is a little bit of the origin story related to this research. Because I think it's hopefully helpful for PhD students to kind of understand how this project even got started in the first place. So this particular paper, I actually began as a PhD student at Georgia State University. It was not a paper I necessarily intended to write. It was a paper that occurred due to circumstances. So in my mind, one way to kind of think about this particular paper, this opportunity, this was an opportunity where I got to bloom where I was planted, if you've heard that phrase before. And sometimes we get planted in this beautiful field and it's very easy to succeed and be good at what we do. And for example, being able to study at Georgia State University with so many great faculty was a great opportunity. It's like being in this beautiful field of flowers and this beautiful landscape that we see here. But sometimes you have situations in which maybe it's a little more like trying to bloom in the desert, where the land is a bit cracked and it's a little bit harder to be successful. And actually, that was kind of the genesis of this particular paper. It was at a time, and where I started working on this paper was at a time whenever I was going through a lot of personal challenges in my life. Like I said, I did not set out to write this paper. There were kind of circumstances that allowed it to happen. And part of what happened is I had a really kind of personal and family crisis that arose. But I couldn't teach the class I was supposed to teach. It was an 8 a.m. Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, and I begged every other PhD student, can you please switch classes with me because of this personal crisis? I couldn't teach at that time of day, and there was just no way around it. And no one would change with me. I'd always changed and tried to accommodate my fellow students, but no one seemed to be able to accommodate me. And I was really frustrated, and I just didn't know what to do. So desperate, I went to my PhD director, which some of you might know who he is or was. It's Dan Roby. And at the time I said, Dan, I can't teach. I'm stuck. No one wants to train with me. I don't know what to do. I'm having this kind of family crisis that I don't know how to deal with. And he said, we'll figure out a solution. And so what ended up happening is there was a student in a different program that needed teaching experience, and we just kind of switched. She had been working for Arun Rai, and she needed experience teaching. I needed to either not teach or teach at a different time. So she took my teaching slot. I took her time as a graduate assistant for Arun Rai. So in kind of this turn of events, I sit down to meet with Arun, and I'm not sure what in the world we're going to work on for this semester. And he goes, Stacie, Detmar Straub and I, we've been really struggling with reviewers not understanding formative measurement and formative constructs. And I think we need to write the paper on formative constructs. And so that's what happened. We decided, you know, out of this difficulty that Arun and Detmar were facing in terms of navigating reviewers and explaining to other readers what formative measurement was, the idea was, let's create our own paper to explain this concept to the field of information systems. So it was a situation that was not my intention that semester. It brought me a great benefit to have that flexibility at a time of crisis to not have to teach that semester. But this is one of those examples where sometimes when things seem barren and dry and not necessarily the best of circumstances, that you can still bloom and you can be successful even when things are challenging. And this paper is kind of a testament to that story. So when times get tough during your PhD program, maybe that's a chance to bloom in a different way than what you might have seen before. So let's talk through this paper, and I look forward to having any questions and dialogue about the paper later, as well as if you have questions about the origins of it, I'm certainly happy to share more as well. But in terms of this talk today, I'm going to kind of structure it in the following way. We're going to go through some of the major concepts in this paper by first talking about the concern, like why we wrote this in the first place. What was the problem that Detmar and Arun struggled with that kind of pushed this paper to happen? What's the terminology, right? So this is a paper that it's written for other academics. And so if you're still learning some of the terminology or still getting familiar with it, we need to have some basic understanding before we can really learn how to make sense of the concepts within the paper. I'm going to talk about what is the problem with construct misspecification. Why do we even care about formative and reflective measurement at all? And then we'll talk about how do we specify constructs appropriately and how do we actually use formative measurement. So in talking about our concern, you know, we're often trained as researchers to come up with really interesting research questions, and then we identify the constructs and the relationships that explain this phenomenon that we're trying to study. We often look for existing measures, or we might create measures for our constructs, and we go through really intensive efforts to identify, you know, really good structural models and theoretical models to explain these relationships between constructs. And in 2007, well, actually this paper, as I mentioned, it started in 2005 is when this paper actually began. And you have to kind of take yourself back 15 years for those of you who are faculty and have been in the field this long. And for those of you who are students, you're probably like, 2005, that was forever ago. In 2005, we were still in the early stages of using both covariance-based SEM, structural equation modeling, and components-based structural equation modeling. So when I say covariance-based structural modeling, I'm talking about tools like EQS and AMOS and Lizroll. Those are some of the big covariance-based tools. Components-based structural equation modeling is predominantly partially squares, PLS. And these tools were rising in popularity because we could examine more complex structural models, and we could look at both the measurement model and the structural model at the same time. We didn't have to only look at the structural model at once and then the measurement model separately. We could look at everything all in one fell swoop. But the problem was that we're starting to notice around this time frame that in other disciplines that academics weren't always specifying their constructs very well. They're doing a great job coming up with these really interesting theoretical structural models, but this relationship between the measure and the construct wasn't always given the proper care that it should have been. And we had prior studies, mostly done in the marketing literature, that had shown that if we measure the construct improperly, so if we specify a construct as reflective, when it really should be formative, it does have an impact on our structural model, and it has an impact on theory. And so these are things that we have to be careful about, right? So if we're having improper specification of constructs, we're going to create results and implications that aren't actually true, right? So we're going to fool ourselves in our process of collecting data. And so this was kind of the concern and the impetus of the paper. Detmar and Arun were really struggling in trying to use the proper way to measure their constructs. And sometimes that proper way was using formative measurement. But so many reviewers and readers didn't understand formative measurement that it just became frustrating, where they're having to spend all this time educating their readers on concepts that were very well known in marketing, but not as well known in the information systems literature. So let's talk a little bit about terminology, just to make sure we're on the same page. So first, recognize, kind of this classic view of measures and constructs. So here we have measures, right? The measures are the individual items or indicators. These are observable, quantifiable scores that we get through self-report or through interview, observation, or some other empirical means. Most often when we're using formative or reflective constructs, we're gathering measures through a survey, and we're gathering multiple measures for any given construct. And a construct is an abstraction that describes an observable or unobservable phenomenon. So we often measure a single construct with multiple items, and then the issue is whether or not these constructs are formative or reflective. So when thinking about the differences between formative and reflective constructs, if we have a construct that we can't observe, sometimes we refer to this as a latent construct, and the directionality goes from construct to the measure, we refer to this as a reflective construct. Now, alternatively, if we have items that are predicting a construct, these items essentially form or create the construct. This is what's known as a formative construct. Now, the terminology between reflective and formative has had some discussion over the past couple of decades. Some people would argue, you can't really argue that a construct is called a reflective construct or a formative construct. We should really refer to them as like reflectively measured and formatively measured constructs. And we typically just use it within the paper and consistently, just to be kind of concise, we tend to refer to constructs as being reflective constructs or formative constructs, but really any construct could be measured reflectively or formatively. It depends on the way in which you measure the construct. So let me give you a couple of examples just to see if this will kind of help you think through some of the differences between reflective constructs and formative constructs. So let's say we have a measure of computer self-efficacy. And so we're trying to measure computer self-efficacy, and let's assume we want to measure this reflectively. We're going to see items that are very unidimensional and similar in their nature. Maybe I'm capable at performing tasks on my computer, and I feel confident in my ability to perform computer-related tasks. So if we had a series of measures along these lines, those would be reflective constructs. If we were measuring computer self-efficacy and we ask questions like, I'm confident in my ability to perform tasks in Word, I'm skillful at using Excel, and we identify different types of technologies that would form or create our understanding of computer self-efficacy, that would be an example of a formative construct. So the same construct, computer self-efficacy, depending on the measures we use, we could identify that construct as being reflective or as formative. I'll give you another example just from the work that I've done with Eve McLean over the years, where we talked about the information system success model. So system quality is another one of those measures we can measure reflectively or formatively. So if we had items that were like, overall, I rate the quality of the system highly. The quality of the system is appropriate for my needs. this system has high system quality. These are all reflective measures. It's all where we have this idea, a central idea of system quality, and those items reflect the nature of the construct that we're trying to measure, which would be system quality. A formative view of system quality might ask individuals to identify the reliability of the system, the ease of use, the complexity, the accessibility, the responsiveness. And it would be that these ideas together form this composite idea of what is system quality. So this is just kind of a very brief distinction between some of those key differences between a reflective construct and a formative construct. When these items are highly unidimensional, they are reflective constructs. When they're measuring tapping into different aspects of the construct and that all kind of come together to form that construct, that would be a formative construct. And you can probably notice that the direction of the arrows is quite different from reflective to formative. That's a big key difference, as well as how we view error in both reflective and formative constructs. So, as I mentioned, we can measure a construct reflectively or formatively. A construct in and of itself isn't necessarily reflective or formative. It's all dependent on the measures. Now, not to bog you down too much with mathematical equations, but sometimes this can be helpful for some people to kind of understand some of these differences between reflective measures and formative measures. And these equations are given in our paper, and we didn't come up with them. These were created by Bolin and Linux back in 1991. And they use these mathematical formulations to help distinguish what is different between a reflective construct and a formative construct. Now, if you're familiar with regression, these are both regression equations, but they're measuring something a bit different. In the reflective panel, so on the left-hand side, y sub I represents the result for an indicator. So if we have 4 items within our reflective construct, we would have 4 different equations. We'd have a separate equation for each item within the construct. And that item is reflected or understood by the coefficient that represents the effect of the variable on the indicator, the result of the variable itself or the reflective construct, and the measurement error for each item. Now, for the formative construct, this regression equation is actually not predicting the indicator, but now predicting the construct that's being estimated. And so rather than the x sub 1 being a reflection of the construct, in the formative version of this, we see where x sub 1 goes to x sub n. These are the items themselves. And now the error is occurring not at the item level, but at the construct level. So the whole way in which we understand reflective and formative constructs, how these are modeled whenever we're performing any kind of analysis using structural equation modeling, it's being performed quite differently because it's whether or not we have an understanding of measuring items and predicting items, or are we predicting a construct? Is the error at the item level, like it is in a reflective construct, or is it at the construct level, like it is with a formative construct? So let's get through a bit more terminology before we kind of dig in a little bit more about why this problem matters. A related topic in formative measurement is the idea of multidimensional constructs. So a multidimensional construct is sometimes we refer to these as second order constructs, but this is where we have a higher order construct, an overarching construct or idea. And then within it, we have sub-dimensions that can be represented within a multidimensional construct. So this picture that we see here, we could see that we have this higher order construct. So let's say this represents organizational performance. And maybe eta sub 1 is profitability, eta sub 2 is productivity, and eta sub 3 is market share. Right? So these are 3 dimensions that all measure and help us understand how we can measure organizational performance. Now, in this particular case, we only have 1 item per construct. So we're measuring profitability using 1 item, productivity using 1 item, and market share using 1 item. But this typically isn't how we look at multidimensional constructs. Typically, we have multiple items per dimension. So if we were to take the same idea of organizational performance, and we were to measure organizational performance based on profitability, productivity, and market share, but now we might have multiple measures for each of these sub-dimensions. We might have multiple measures for profitability, multiple measures for productivity, and multiple dimensions for market share. So why does this matter? Okay, so let's take a step back. So this first panel that we have that's on the left, mathematically, this picture is the same as the picture that we see of a formative construct, the picture that I had on the previous slide for a formative construct. So we could view a formative construct as a multidimensional construct where each dimension has a single item associated with that particular dimension or facet of the construct. Or if we were really interested in a construct and really wanted to kind of have a deeper insight into it, we could expand out each of these sub-dimensions and we could have more items or questions that we could ask. Now, with multidimensional constructs, these get quite complicated quite quickly. And so we can have scenarios in which here you can see that these are reflective second order constructs or reflective relationships between the subdimension and the items themselves. But these could be formatively measured as well. So we could have a reflective or formative relationship. Oops, this second relationship that we have, this relationship between the first order construct and the second order construct, or the multidimensional construct and its subdimensions. In this diagram, we're seeing that it's a formative relationship, but this could be either reflective or formative. Our paper discusses this a little bit. Jarvis et al. Does a really nice job kind of explaining the differences between constructs, and there's several other great papers within both the marketing literature and IS literature that go into more detail between multidimensional and formative constructs and all of the differences between them. And we can certainly talk more about that later if that's helpful to you. But you know, some of the same ideas that we talk about with formative measurement are related to multidimensional constructs. But the key that we want people to take away when reading our paper is all of these are really important measurement considerations that impact our structural models that we're evaluating and using to test theory. So we need to put a lot of care and time into thinking about what is the most appropriate way in which we need to measure our construct. And if we are using multidimensional constructs, we got to think about, is each relationship formative or reflective? Because this can create many implications for our overall research model. So, all right, we've seen a little bit about the problem. We've seen a little bit about the theory. Let's talk in more detail about what's the issue with construct misspecification. Why is this a problem and why do we even care? Okay, so the reason we care is that if the relationship between the item and the constructs are pointing in the wrong direction, it's going to impact other aspects of the research model. So for example, Jarvis et al., this is a paper that was written about formative measurement in the context of marketing. And in this paper, Cheryl Jarvis and her colleagues, they examined a 5-construct model, just like what we see here. We have 5 different constructs here. And they did perform simulations to see what happens if a single formative construct was misspecified as reflective. So let's take this case here of the area that's circled. We have eta 1. And let's say in this particular case, a researcher said, this construct is modeled as reflective, but in reality, it was formative. The arrow should point in the opposite direction. The error term should be captured at the construct level. So let's assume that this construct is misspecified. So they ran simulations to see what happens. And they found that structural paths that emanate from a construct that's misspecified has an upward bias. So like we can see here, this relationship between eta 1 and eta 2 is going to be artificially inflated upward if we misspecify the construct. It also found that structural paths leading to misspecified constructs have a downward bias. So this relationship between the exogenous variable and eta 1 now has this downward bias. It's less likely to find significance for that relationship as a result, or it's like going to have this a smaller magnitude in terms of the bias, or in terms of the relationship between the exogenous variable and eta 1. Other studies found similar results. So another study, again, another one in marketing by McKinsey et al., they looked at bias in a 2-construct model and said, what happens if we misspecify one of the constructs or both of the constructs? And we say they're reflective when in reality they're formative. So just for simplicity, let's just kind of narrow this down and look at these 2 constructs as the relationship. When the exogenous construct was misspecified, there was an upward bias. When the endogenous construct was misspecified, there was a downward bias. So some similar findings related to Jarvis in terms of if we do misspecify constructs in a model, we do get a bias in the magnitude of the results. If both constructs are misspecified, so if both of these constructs are modeled as reflective, when they really should have been formative, we also have a slight downward bias that occurs. So here was our question. These prior simulations, these were articles that ran Monte Carlo simulations, and they focused on the accuracy of parameter estimates. And they just identified, does the magnitude of the parameter estimate change if there's misspecification in the model? But what we wanted to find out is, does the significance of the parameter estimate change? So more specifically, does the downward bias lead to type 2 error, or does the upward bias lead to type 1 error? Because our suspicion is, and was at the time, that if there is type 1 or type 2 error that could occur when we misspecify formative constructs, we're then getting results in papers that are leading us to the wrong theoretical conclusions. And that's a problem, because so much of what we do in terms of our research, and especially in terms of quantitative measurements, is we're testing theory. And if we're testing a theory, but we're getting type 1 and type 2 error because we've misspecified the constructs, what are we missing? What might we not understand that we really think we do? Or what are we not investigating that we should be investigating? So that's what we want to find out. So we ran our own set of simulations using a similar process as what Jarvis et al. Performed. And we found that the answer to this question, does the significance of parameter estimates change if we misspecify a construct, is yes. Yes, it does. So this points to a problem. And in our paper, we identify some decision rules, and this is a screenshot directly from our paper, that identify when these types of errors are likely to occur. So depending on whether or not our formative construct is endogenous in the model or exogenous in the model, depending on how high our sample size is or how low our sample size is, depending on how much correlation we have among the formative measures themselves, these can all affect whether or not we're likely to have type 1 or type 2 errors. So part of my process as a doctoral student running these simulations, they could take hours to run a set of simulations on my computer. So often before I went to bed at night, I'd set up my laptop to run these simulations. I'd go to bed and I would just pray that the simulation would complete, or that my laptop wouldn't have an error overnight so I could have the results in the morning. And then I'd get things ready to go. And then if I had a big window of time where it could run some simulations again, I'd set it up to run those simulations, go off, do something else, and then come back and just hope that everything ran correctly. But I spent a lot of time that semester running simulations to try to understand when it's likely for these type 1 and type 2 errors occur. Within the paper itself, there's a lot more of the details in terms of exactly where we found these errors and where we didn't. But I won't spend too much time on that now. I won't go into that now, just so we can have time to talk about, why these things are a problem. So getting back to why this matters, why does construct misspecification make a difference? It's because errors in the measurement model can lead researchers to the wrong conclusions about the theories that they're examining. So we're confirming theoretical relationships improperly if we have type 1 error, and we're disconfirming theoretical relationships due to type 2 error. So because this could be a problem, one thing we were asked to do in the review process was to identify how common does measurement model misspecification occur? Because one of the questions the reviewers asked was, okay, so type 1 and type 2 error could occur, but who cares? Maybe everyone in information systems specifies formative and reflective constructs correctly. And if they do, then we don't have this problem. Well, we already knew from the marketing literature that about 29% of constructs were misspecified. So within the information systems literature, we looked at publications in information systems research, MIS Quarterly, and Journal of Management Information Systems over a 3-year period. And we found that about 30% of the constructs were also misspecified based on this period of time. So we were able to use all of this kind of both simulation and a review of the literature to help explain to readers and reviewers why construct misspecification was such a problem and why we needed to do something about it. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, right? We've talked about what's the issue, we've explained some terminology, we've talked about why construct misspecification matters. So hopefully now you're thinking to yourself, well, how do I know if my construct's reflective or formative? And if that's your question, we're going to talk about that, as well as how do we actually use formative constructs appropriately. So within our paper, we identify and we kind of adapt some of the other research and literature on this topic to explain different decision rules that we can use when we're trying to identify if a construct is reflective or formative. And so in the screenshot, you're seeing kind of the visual. Sometimes it's helpful to remember which direction things work and kind of see the pictures as we talk through kind of these different decision rules that can help us decide, is a construct reflective or is it formative? So I would encourage you, anytime you're using quantitative methods and you're going to be collecting data, but using surveys or experiments or things like this, in which you're going to have multiple items per construct, it's really important to take some time and think through these 4 decision rules. So the first decision rule that we have is asking, what is the direction of causality? Is it going from construct to item? If so, that's reflective. If it's going from item to construct, then it's formative. Well, you might be asking, well, how do I know which direction my arrows are really pointing? So we have kind of 3 sub-questions that you can ask to try to think through this. Are the items a manifestation of the construct, or do they define the construct? So in a reflective construct, the items are manifestations of what we mean by the construct itself. So if we think about the computer self-efficacy example I gave earlier, and we think about things about the items being about being skillful to use the computer and being confident in using the computer, this is a manifestation of the construct. If we're defining the construct and we're asking about computer self-efficacy in terms of, are you good at using Excel and Word and Access and Google Meet and a large number of technologies, these are defining the construct. And so that would suggest that it's a formative measurement. Another way to think about it is, where does the change happen? Does the change in the items, is that what changes and then the construct changes? Or does the construct change first and then the items change? Okay, so let's kind of walk through this example a little bit. Let's take service quality as another example. Okay, so if I'm measuring service quality in a formative way in which I'm using things like accessibility and reliability and ease of use as ways to measure service quality. So in order, in this case, for service quality to change, it would have to be that, system quality to change, it would have to be, for example, ease of use. Maybe there's a change that happens to the system and the system isn't as easy to use as it used to be. Well, that's changing first, and that is causing my measure, or that measure of ease of use is now causing my construct of system quality to change. So if it's the measure that's changing first, that influences the construct, that would be a formative relationship. The item is changing, which then impacts the construct. If we think about the reflective way to measure service quality, and we would say the measures of service quality would be, I keep saying service, I mean system quality. The measures of system quality would be things like, the system is easy to use, I enjoy using the system is of high quality, right? So if we have these kinds of measures that are the overarching dimensions and our overarching view of system quality as a construct has to change before the items change. So thinking about what happens first, the item or the construct can help us identify the direction between the construct and the items. A second question we want to ask, are the items interchangeable? If we have a reflective construct, the items must be interchangeable. We refer to this as unidimensionality. And so we expect that all reflective items are unidimensional. They could be substituted. If we drop one of those items, the construct remains the same. They all have a similar content or theme, and that would be true of reflective constructs. But in formative constructs, the items aren't necessarily interchangeable. They're not necessarily on the same theme. And if we drop an item, we do change the construct. If I'm asking about computer self-efficacy, and I initially have Word, Excel, Access, Google Meet, email, and I take out email, that changes my construct, right? So it's really important to think about the role of the items and how similar and different that they are from each other. If they're different from each other, they're not interchangeable, you're more likely working with the formative construct. A third way that we can identify is my construct reflective or formative, is to identify, is there covariation among the items themselves? Again, because a reflective construct, they're going to be unidimensional. These items will have a very high level of covariation between them. And a change in one item would be manifested by changes in other items. But with formative constructs, it doesn't work quite the same way. If I'm measuring system quality, I can have a change in ease of use that doesn't necessarily impact reliability. And so if a change in one item doesn't necessarily change in another item, you're probably working with a formative construct. The fourth point is looking at the nomenological net of the construct items themselves. Do the items have the same antecedents and consequences? In reflective constructs, they absolutely will, because again, these items are interchangeable. But with formative measures, the items are not necessarily interchangeable. The things that predict reliability are different than the antecedents of accessibility or the antecedents of ease of use. And so if there's different antecedents and consequences to the items themselves, this is probably indicative of a formative construct. Now, one thing I will say that it doesn't necessarily mention in the paper is that sometimes when you're looking at constructs, especially well-established constructs, many times you'll notice, well, some of these items feel very reflective, but there's a couple of items that maybe feel formative. And so one thing that as you start paying more attention to how items are actually represented within constructs is that often we encounter constructs, or we have some really well-known and well-used constructs in our field that aren't purely reflective and they're not purely formative. And we either need to model them appropriately as being a component of both reflective and formative elements, or we need to make sure that our constructs are either purely reflective or purely formative. Sometimes what happens is we will maybe have poor measures. We're intending to have a reflective construct, but we didn't think carefully about how we're generating those measures, and we'll call it formative, but really it's just a poorly reflective construct, right? So we just have to be very careful about how we actually specify our constructs and make sure that we're really meeting the rules of reflective models and formative models. If it's a reflective construct, make it a reflective construct. Make sure you meet all those rules. If it's a formative construct, make it a good formative construct. Either one is appropriate, but make sure you do it well, whichever technique you actually use. So how do we actually use formative constructs in practice? So one of the things that we really thought about as we're trying to develop this paper and offer advice for reviewers and for readers is to really think about, okay, how can formative measurement be used? How does that change your approach before and after data collection? So before data collection, if you do choose to use formative measurement and formative constructs, take the time to really think about the constructs themselves. You have to identify, do you have formative constructs that you're intending to have within your research model? Again, even if we're using existing items, sometimes those measures have always been measured reflectively, but maybe they're better measured as formative. And so take the time to really look at this relationship between construct and item to think about and identify, do you have formative constructs within your measurement model at all? If you do, then you need to assess the content validity of formative constructs. Content validity is the type of validity we don't often use, especially if we have reflective constructs, because content validity is really making sure that the entire domain of the construct is captured. With reflective constructs, it's not as important because all of the items are interchangeable. And so content validity is not all that relevant. But for formative constructs, because the items actually define or form or create the construct, we have to make sure that the entire domain of the construct is captured. And so we can establish content validity using things like a literature review or expert panels or Q-sorts. But the key thing is that we should always, always, always examine content validity anytime we're using formative constructs. A third step that we need to perform is we need to identify, are we planning to analyze our model using covariance-based structural equation modeling or components-based structural equation modeling? If we're using components-based structural equation modeling, otherwise known as PLS, it's a bit easier to model a construct as formative or reflective. Depending on which tool you use, generally you click on a construct and you identify, is it mode A, B, or C? It's a pretty straightforward approach. But if you're using covariance-based structural equation modeling, you can still have formative constructs within your model, but it takes a bit more planning. It's important with covariance-based structural equation model that we have models that are identified. And to have identification, it's a bit more tricky if we have formative measurement. We have to either constrain structural paths or error terms, which affects the theory and the theoretical implications based on the choices that we make. We have to make sure that there's at least 2 structural paths that emanate from the formative construct to reflective constructs, or we have to have 2 reflective measures as part of the construct, or we might have to decompose the model if the formative construct only has 1 path. So a lot of times in papers, I'll read, we used PLS because we have a formative measure in our model. And that's not a reason alone to use PLS. You can absolutely use covariance-based structural equation modeling if that's the tool you want to use, but you do have to plan your research model a bit differently. You have to do some forethought before data collection to make sure that you can actually analyze the model that you're intending to study. Now, I don't want to get too deep into creating and to explaining how to ensure identification when using covariance-based models, but I do want to mention 2 popular approaches that can be used that I just mentioned and offer kind of a picture to explain. So one of the rules with covariance-based structural equation modeling, so if you're using EQS, AMIS, Lizerol, is if we have a formative measurement, we have to have 2 paths that emanate, that lead from the formative construct to something that is reflective. So this could be that we have a formative construct that predicts 2 reflective constructs. Or another alternative that we could do is we could see this panel on the left. It's called a multiple indicators, multiple causes model. Sometimes we refer to this as a MIMIC model, where you can see we have these 3 formative indicators, but we also have 2 reflective indicators. And so if we can model our formative construct in this way, where we have both reflective and formative indicators, as long as we have at least 2 reflective indicators, this one little mini model, this construct here, is now identified. And we can insert this into any structural equation model that we want. So this is one trick to ensure that we can use a formative construct even when using covariance-based SEM. Another trick we can do is doing what's known as a decomposed model. So here we have on the right side, we have a reflective construct that's predicting an endogenous construct, eta sub 1. And we also had a formative construct at the bottom, but you can see rather than actually having the items go to a construct, now the items are predicting the endogenous construct, eta sub 1. And so this would be one way to help try to move to a more identified model if we don't have other strategies to help us reach identification, is we can decompose the model. Mathematically, this is the same as having a formative construct within the model itself. So we can use covariance-based structural equation modeling with formative constructs, but like I said, we just have to plan those structural models a bit differently than maybe if we're using a tool like PLS. Okay, so what happens after data collection? So the steps that I talked about before, this is all things that we did before we actually collect the data. But once we have the data, how do we validate our formative constructs? Well, construct validity works a bit differently for formative measurement and formative constructs versus reflective constructs. We're not as concerned about convergent validity or discriminant validity in a formative construct. Convergent validity has to do in making sure that the items all load together, and discriminant validity is to make sure that the items don't load on different constructs. But remember, with formative constructs, items don't necessarily covary, so they might not load on the same construct. We don't need to actually use common factor analysis and look at loadings of constructs like we typically do with reflective constructs. We should use principal components analysis and look at the weights of the constructs. And so that becomes really important to think about. We have to evaluate validity of a formative construct differently than we evaluate the validity of a reflective construct. Now, one thing that's really important is to think about, what do we do if we have non-significant weights? There are some papers that followed up after our paper that kind of talked about how to deal with some of these issues. And really, kind of the most we said in this paper is that if you have weights that are non-significant, you need to have some careful consideration about that. And the key here is the idea that since every item defines and forms the construct, if we eliminate an item because the weight is non-significant, we've now conceptually changed the definition of the construct. So there's arguments that we often will leave in weights that are very low or non-significant to make sure that we're really defining the construct appropriately. So there's a lot more kind of theoretical and logical validation associated with these constructs, not just necessarily empirical and numerical like we see with reflective constructs. Reliability takes a different role when we're talking about formative measurement. So in reflective measures, we often use internal consistency, and we're using measures like Cronbach's alpha in order to identify if a construct is unidimensional. But that's not what we really need to measure with formative measures. We don't want internal consistency with formative constructs because it creates multicollinearity, which is going to destabilize our research model. So actually, we need to make sure that we don't have too much multicollinearity among our items in the model. And so we can look at variance inflation factors, VIFs, and our recommendation is that they should be between 3.3 to 4 to make sure we don't have too much multicollinearity, which can then create more opportunity for type 1 or type 2 errors, as we learned with our simulation that we did kind of when explaining what this problem was with misspecification of constructs. So if we really want to understand the reliability of a construct, this means something different with formative measurement. And if we are using covariance-based SEM, we could do something like look at the construct disturbance term. We could look at the error within the construct to have a better understanding of how much reliability, or kind of a measure of reliability in the context of formative measurement. Otherwise, we could use like a test, retest reliability, but we often don't do this. We don't usually ask our measures multiple times within the same study at 2 different points in time to see how well they hold up over time. But that would be a better way to measure reliability than internal consistency. So one of my pet peeves I sometimes see is someone will use a formative construct within a paper and they report Cronbach's alpha, and it has no place whenever we're using formative constructs for a measurement model. Other considerations we have to have if we're analyzing formative constructs, again, it varies depending on if we're using covariance-based SEM versus components-based SEM. So if it's covariance-based SEM, Lizroll, Amos, EQS, we need to be very thoughtful about our model specification. We need to make sure we go through some extra steps to really make sure that our formative constructs are validated appropriately. And there's some ways to do this. We kind of explain how we can go about this within the paper itself by using nested models and doing chi-square difference tests to evaluate which model is better. We also have to think about both the measurement model and the structural model. So we're going to look at those disturbance terms of formative constructs. If we have very large error terms, that suggest problems with the items themselves, and we have to think about model fit a bit differently when we have formative constructs within the model. If we're using PLS or covariant or components-based SEM, we'd want to pay more attention to the weights of the formative measures instead of the loadings. If we have reflective measures, we look at loadings. Formative measures, we need to look at weights, and then we follow similar processes that we see before, like using R-square values and other parameters to help us assess the model itself. We also provided some insight in the paper about how to use formative constructs. And so there's a whole section within the paper talking about how do we, as a reviewer, assess papers that use formative constructs. And part of the reason this is included within the paper is because the reviewers asked us to. There was concern that, hey, once we write this paper, people are going to say, I'm rejecting your paper because it's formative. You have a formative construct and you didn't do it correctly. And there was this concern that this paper might become the hammer or a gatekeeper from papers being from good research being accepted and published within the field. And so we really wanted to make sure we explained to reviewers how to evaluate formative constructs if they come across this within an article. And so our first piece of advice is to make sure that you're looking and examining are constructs being specified correctly as formative and reflective. Using kind of those 4 points we talked about before in terms of construct specification can go a long way to maybe provide some guidance to review or to authors to let them know that, hey, this construct appears to be formative. Maybe you have misspecification in your model. Can you revisit it? Or, okay, this seems to satisfy the conditions associated with being reflective, so everything looks good in terms of your model. We also encourage people to consider the validation approaches used for examining formally measured constructs. So, for example, if you're a reviewer and you see that a construct is modeled as formative, Don't ask the author to provide Cronbach's alpha, or don't ask the author to perform convergent validity on those formative constructs. So we really wanted to encourage reviewers to make sure that they were educated in knowing kind of what validation is appropriate for formative constructs as opposed to reflective constructs. We also encouraged reviewers not to assume that every research model that has a formative construct has to be analyzed using PLS. So again, I see this all the time in articles that say, I'm using PLS because I have a formative construct in the model. PLS is easier to use if you have formative constructs, but again, with careful planning, covariance-based methods can be used and they can be quite informative. So just because we have formative constructs, that's not a reason to use PLS. It can be part of the reason to use PLS, but that's not the only reason that PLS can and should be used. As a scholar, how should you consider the use of formative constructs? Well, make sure you really think about your measurement model before you collect the data itself, right? Doing a little bit of pre-planning can help go a long way in ensuring that you set yourself up for success when you're analyzing the data. And that's true if you're using purely reflective constructs or a combination of reflective and formative constructs. And as I mentioned before, you want to make sure that you're thinking about, do I have reflective constructs? Do I have formative constructs? Or do I have poorly measured constructs? Right? There's a difference between all three of these things. Ideally, you want reflective constructs or formative constructs. You want to stay away from those very poorly measured constructs. If you are using formative constructs or multidimensional constructs, have a reason for doing so. I'll be honest, my preference is to avoid formative constructs when I can. And I think that surprises a lot of people. Just because I wrote a paper about formative constructs doesn't mean I advocate that they're always useful. They are much more complicated to analyze and more challenging to analyze and create. So if I can find a good reflective measure, or I can create a good reflective measure, that's what I'm going to use. But there are times where formative constructs or multidimensional constructs can provide a lot more insight than a reflective construct can. And if that's the case, then use them. Use formative constructs and multidimensional constructs. These are great tools to have when analyzing data and collecting data. But make sure you have a good reason for using these types of constructs. Make sure you know that you need to establish content validity for these types of constructs, right? That it can't just be that, hey, I came up with some items and these sound pretty good to me. You have to do this extra step of content validity, of making sure that you've reviewed the literature, making sure you've maybe done some expert review, some Q sorts, really make sure that you've defined the construct fully within the measures themselves. Also, make sure you know how you're going to analyze your data before you start, because if you do want to use AMIS or EQS or some type of covariance-based model tool, if you haven't really thought about your research model, you're going to run into problems if you end up using a formative construct. You might then be forced to use something like PLS, not because it was the technique you wanted to use or was the best technique for your study, it's because you didn't plan appropriately ahead of time before collecting your data. I would also say as a scholar, you need to make sure that you validate your formative measures appropriately. It works different than reflective constructs like we've mentioned before. We look at loadings instead of loadings versus weights, loadings for reflective constructs, weights for formative constructs. Internal consistency and reliability is measured completely differently. And we have to make different choices about how we deal with items with low weights. If we have an item with a low loading and it's reflective, we can throw it out because all of the items are essentially measuring the same thing. If it's a low weight, we have to think more carefully about how we want to proceed. And last but not least, the theoretical relationships within the measurement and structural model need to be at the forefront of your mind whenever you're deciding exactly how and when to use formative constructs within a model. Anytime you add an item to a formative measure, or you take away an item to a formative measure, whenever you change that direction of the relationship from formative to reflective and vice versa, it does change theoretical relationships within the model. So keeping theory in mind to guide you as you're making decisions, whether or not you're measuring things formatively or reflectively, or how that's going to impact both the measurement model and the structural model, is really important when using formative measurement. So with that, I know that was a lot of content. Hopefully it was helpful in some way. I'm looking forward to answering any questions you have. Here's my email address. If you ever have questions also after the talk or about this or anything else too, feel free to contact me. Alex and others also have my email address, so feel free to reach out to them for that, or Google me. I'm not too hard to find out there. But yeah, that's what I have. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Should I take over from here?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. I'm not sure if I have access to the questions of the people that are attending, but I have several questions I'd like to ask Stacie. So, okay, I'm looking at the chat here. I believe Flavio is going to take care of mentioning the questions that people have. So, well, let's start with my questions, and then we add these ones here too, because they all seem to be very good questions. So, Stacie, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really, really interesting, clarifying. And I've read your papers, I believe, a few times since it was published. And I was reading it again yesterday just to make sure I have everything fresh in my mind for this presentation. So it's good to have you here, because nowadays I have new questions from totally different from those that I had when I read it for the first time. But before we start with more specific questions, I just wanted to ask you about the status of formative constructs in the literature. If you have any feeling whatsoever of how things are being handled by both by researchers, authors, and reviewers nowadays.
That's a great question. Yeah, I think with formative measurement, I still occasionally see it. I feel like it went through a period right after kind of this paper was published where it became very popular that people go, aha, here's a solution. And then the realization kind of sunk in of, this is more complicated than it initially appears, right? It's nice whenever you can, maybe in PLS, for example. PLS is great, but part of what its challenge is, it's almost too easy to use that we sometimes don't really understand the choices we're making. And so people would flip from mode A to mode B, and that's all you had to do was to make your construct from reflective to formative. And we would see papers with just very poorly measured reflective constructs. They flip it to formative. Now things work in the model, and they don't have to worry about that pesky reliability or construct validity, and they kind of get out of all their problems. And so people then started running into problems using formative measurement. So I would say that more often when it is used with just strictly formative measures, they tend to be, I feel like there tend to be more robust measures these days than kind of right after this paper came out. I don't feel like I see as many, but they're still out there, especially with certain types of constructs. A lot of performance-based constructs, it's really hard to measure those reflectively. Like we tend to measure them formatively. I think multidimensional constructs, we still see a lot of that out there. And again, those they have their own challenges as well in terms of measuring. And occasionally I've used multidimensional constructs in research studies that I've done, but I only use them when I need them. And I think that's one thing that people don't always appreciate. Like you really just, if you need them, use them. They're a great tool to have in your toolkit. But if that's not the best way, if you can measure it reflectively, do that. But there are times where you do get this richness that you can benefit from a formative measure, or you just really can't tap into what you want to measure unless you measure it formatively. So they're still out there. I think we see it a little bit less, but I think where we do see it, it tends to be better than kind of in that early 2010 stage where kind of people then had time to read the paper, make sense of it, and start submitting things. I saw a lot of really bad examples of formative measurement back then.
Well, just connecting to this question, we here in Brazil tend to use a lot of scales that were developed from researchers from abroad. Sorry. And sometimes these are old scales. What I mean is that, they are some of them that were, that people noticed that were misspecified. They were supposed to be formative, and they are originally or have been used as reflective reflective measure models in the literature. So how should we go about this? Like, if you want to use a scale for a construct that is actually formative, but in the literature, it is being used as a reflective construct, do we fix it? Do we leave it as it is?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And in the paper itself, I find it interesting that no one beat me up on this or criticized me for this point. But I picked on TAM measures, particularly perceived usefulness, for being a formative measure. I'm surprised I haven't been tarred and feathered yet. But everyone measures that measure reflectively. And it bothers me to no end, because the reason they measure it reflectively, the justification I always get is, but it loads so well together, right? The Cronbach's alphas are very high. They all load on the same construct. So the numbers make sense that it's a reflective construct. But if you actually pay attention to the items, these are not reflective. They're not interchangeable. They do not have this causality that goes from items or from construct to measure, right? But yet, if I were to include perceived usefulness in a paper, you almost have to measure it reflectively, because everyone's gonna, like, no reviewer will let you get it through formatively. So I think this is kind of sometimes the struggle, and I've had this struggle before of kind of this crisis where, do I go with the status quo? Do I push the status quo? If I'm using PLS in that particular model, I can easily flip it to make myself at least feel better, to know, okay, if I don't, it doesn't change my model, right? I can kind of do my own sensitivity analysis on it. And so I think some of it depends on the stream of literature that you're using and how open your reviewers and your editors are, because you still have to play the game at the end of the day, right? You have to convince those 3 to 5 people that your paper is suitable for publication. And if it is a measure that is so strongly entrenched as reflective, I think you pick your battle, and that might not be the battle to fight. If it's a measure from a different discipline that people might not be as familiar with, you might be able to fight that battle and kind of be more true to what your sense is of that measure and maybe gain new insight from it. But I think there are some battles that are a bit difficult to kind of push what is probably a better way of modeling it through, given kind of the inertia that sometimes happens.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And if you are developing your own construct, do you think where should we describe the measurement model in your paper? Should we hypothesize a measurement model, or should it be just a part of the operationalization of the constructs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like we could get some really interesting insights if we pay attention and actually hypothesize the measurement model, but no one will publish that, I don't think. I think it would take a really bold editor to kind of get into those details, because often in our research these days, we're so focused on the theory itself and the structural model that a lot of the things that are part of the measurement model, they get relegated to an appendix, or they have to get collapsed way down, or they end up in a footnote. So I think taking the time to really think through those things to the extent that you can hypothesize about them would be incredibly valuable, but I would not necessarily put that in a paper because I don't think that would be the easiest thing for them to tell you to cut out, because they want to see the theory development. They want to see those hypothesized relationships in the structural model. So I think really what you end up doing is in the methodology section, and you're talking about the creation of your measures, you explain how you created them. You might, usually I will explain, like in a paper I recently published, we did create this formative measurement looking at kind of this breadth of use, and it talked about different use of different types of technologies. So we explained how we came up with this very comprehensive list of technologies, and as such, it was formative. But we just had to explain that in the paper, right? And it was more about how we came up with that list, which would just be establishing content validity, and that's really kind of where that came into the paper in the method section.
Right, right. Again, also related to the scales that we use for formative constructs, we have a situation right now, a colleague of mine and I, where we are using in our model some constructs that were actually measured by the company using their own methods, such as performance. Performance evaluations is always the case. So they have their own method of creating this index that they call performance evaluation. If we want to use things like this, they're ready, the companies create, or you get it somewhere, can you directly apply it in a paper and say, this is how, in our case, this is how we measure, not we, but the company measures, so we are using it?
I think, yeah, and I think whenever performance is a great example of one of those constructs that often is best suited measured formatively, because you do want to capture these many different aspects of performance. And so I would say what would be important there is how you're defining performance. So if performance is the construct, you need to make sure that your definition of the construct matches the types of measures that you have that you're going to use for that formative measure. And so I would say that would be kind of my first tip, number one, is making sure that there's a good alignment between your definition of the construct and the measures you actually have to measure performance. So if you're including in your measure performance something like market share, but the organization didn't measure that, that's going to throw you off, right? So just make sure that there's good, tight alignment between construct definition and measurements themselves. What you might even though want to consider is even decomposing that formative construct and seeing, because sometimes, because there's different antecedents and consequences to the items within a formative construct. So let's say you have productivity, profitability, and market share. You might find that construct A and B really predict productivity, B only predicts profitability, and C only predicts market share, right? But you wouldn't get that nuance if you tried to collapse it all into performance. So often, a lot of times when I have a formative measurement, I will measure it, like I will test it as a formative construct, but then I'll decompose it as well, because sometimes that's more an interesting story than having it all collapsed into a single construct like performance.
Yes, and now that I mention, I remember a paper, a reviewer asked us to estimate the impact of some of the measures of a formative construct on an exogenous variable. And that is fine. But then he also the formative construct was also the dependent variable, latent variable of another construct, latent variable in the model. So, and he wanted us to give a sense of how much this independent variable was affecting a measure of the formative construct. And we were arguing that you cannot do this with a formative construct. So and he seemed to be okay with that afterwards when we told him in the review and trying to explain. But decomposition would make sense in this case, right? You can have these types of information.
And I think it depends. I think though you can be absolutely right to argue that no, like sometimes conceptually we do want those measures to not be decomposed. They really are measuring this idea of performance, and we need them bundled together. And so this is where the theoretical arguments come in, and why theory plays such a big role in measurement, but we seem to ignore it sometimes. Because if we decompose the construct, then we now have very different theoretical implications. If we're now predicting market share versus profitability, as opposed to now this construct is predicting organizational performance, right? That changes how we are understanding and viewing our theory in these relationships. So I think it's absolutely appropriate to leave a construct, you know, in its full form, right? You can leave it as a formative construct, but if it makes sense and there can be different insights that might be useful by decomposing it, that can also be kind of a trick to pull out as well when trying to make sense of your data.
There's a few papers out there that heavily criticize the usage of formative constructs. I read one by Jeffrey Edwards, and the title is really interesting, just for you guys that are attending the presentation, to have a sense of how hard people can be in their critics. But it's here, The Fallacy of Formative Measurement. This is the name of the paper. It was published in Organizational Research Methods. And he has very good points, very good points. Some of them, I think, of course, he wasn't using, this was published, when was that? 2011, so a little bit afterwards. But Jeffrey Edwards is a management researcher. He probably doesn't pay attention to the IS literature. But some of the points he made are really important. I think they have a lot to do with what we were talking just now, from a more theoretical standpoint. He talks a lot about the causality, almost like the ontological basis of a formative construct versus a reflective construct. And in this sense, he's saying that, for instance, that there cannot be causality. You cannot say that a measure of a formative construct causes the construct itself. There's not this is just the relationship is more one of a composition or formation, but not a causality. Do you agree with this?
So I think there's been a lot of criticisms of formative measurement, and even within IS at one point there was a call that we should abandon all formative measurement until we can figure out how to better validate it and explain it. I don't know how we make much progress if we just cease doing things. So I don't know that I necessarily agree with that point of view, but this goes back to kind of my perspective where don't go here thinking this is the easy way out. Formative constructs is the difficult path. It's not the path of least resistance, it's the path of most resistance, because there's so many things that can go awry in formative measurement. So Kim and Grover also published an article, I think it was in 2013 or 2014 in MIS Quarterly, criticizing the use of formative measurement and saying, the problem is with formative measurement, because these items define the construct. And if you collect different data and then you move that construct, like the weights are going to change from study to study. So what does that even mean if the weights are constantly changing from study to study to study? But don't we also do this with qualitative studies where things change from study to study to study, but we can still generalize to a theory? So we can generalize to theory and can generalize up with some methods, but in other methods, we're kind of not as comfortable with doing this. So my view of it is that I do think, yes, if you want to get very strict in terms of, yes, establishing causality between item to construct, that's difficult to do because how do you actually measure something that's unobservable, right? And so I can, sure, if we want to take the word cause out of it, that's fine, and just say paths lead from item to construct, or it's a composite. I'm comfortable with that language. I wouldn't necessarily argue with that point of view. Does it mean that, in my point of view, should we abandon all use of formative measurement? No, but I also don't think we should use it carelessly either, right? We should make sure that there's good reason and recognize that there's going to be limitations, just like there's limitations with reflective measurement. I think we also forget, like when we're kind of attacking formative measurement, we're then assuming that reflective measurement doesn't have its problems as well, when it clearly does, right? Everything that we're doing is fallible. It's just we need to make the best choices we can with the resources and constraints and knowledge that we have.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is a great point. And people tend to forget that every method has its limitations and has its assumptions that have to be true to make the results reliable. And this happens a lot, for instance, with PLS and SEM, such as Israel, and covariance-based versus component-based. And do you think this is still there? When you submit your papers, do you get this feeling that if you use PLS, it's going to be kind of downgraded in the review?
It depends on the journal. And so there are journals that I've had papers rejected from because I've used PLS, even though I've had reasons to use PLS. I've had papers where the author or the editor had said, we really want you to use covariance-based modeling. And in that case, we were able to be able to do that and those particular models, and we were able to make that happen. I think I think PLS gets kind of a bad reputation. Some of it's earned, I think, and because it's a victim of its own success. I wrote an editorial when I was editor-in-chief at the Database for Advances in Information Systems. One of the great things you get to do as editor-in-chief is you can get on your soapbox and just share whatever you want to say. And so I did write an editorial called Haters Gonna Hate, the use of PLS in information systems, kind of talking about why people hate on PLS. And I actually wrote that editorial out of anger because of kind of a couple of journals' unilateral moves to say, we will not publish any research using PLS. And I wanted to be very strong in our commentary at Database that we're open to publishing research using PLS, but you need to have a good reason for doing it, right? There's reasons we can use covariance-based SEM. There's also good reasons to use components-based SEM. But I think sometimes with PLS, it's a victim of its own success. It's become so easy to use that people don't understand the choices that they're making. So when I make this kind of flippant comment about people changing from mode A to mode B, which is from reflective to formative, they don't really know what they're doing. So they create bad models. And then people blame PLS rather than blaming the researcher for not understanding the difference between a reflective and a formative construct, or between mode A to mode B. We don't need to blame the tool when people use it poorly. We need to blame, not that there should be blame, but we need to address the scholar, right? And help educate them to make sure that they're using the tool appropriately. So I feel like the blame has been put on PLS when that's not the problem. It's usually the knowledge base of the person using it. We say we want systems that are easy to use, right? TAM, our most well-known model, or UTAUT, right? One of the key things is effort expectancy, that it's very easy to use, and we blame PLS for being so easy to use. To me, that's a hypocrisy that's kind of ridiculous, if I'm being frank.
Do you think it would be for a new somebody just out of the PhD program, would it be kind of advisable to stick with covariance-based SEM?
I would say, yeah, I would say right now, until the tide turns, or unless you know where to publish it. I mean, there are certain outlets that are still very friendly towards partial least squares. And so the Database for Advances in Information Systems is friendly towards PLS. So if you're trying to target those types of outlets, you can absolutely publish your work there. Pay attention to editorial boards. If you're seeing people that have published and continue to publish using PLS, they're probably not going to reject your paper for using PLS, right? So you can also kind of look at who's on the editorial boards. There's only a couple of journals that are very, kind of emphatic, we don't use it. It's often more an editorial decision than it is like at the senior editor level is usually kind of the one that will push back. So if you can, right, you get to write a cover letter when you submit a paper to a journal, look at that editorial list, find people who are friendly towards PLS and recommend them if you are using it. But I would say make sure you do leave your PhD program with knowledge of how to use covariance-based SEM. And if you can create a model, like you might feel, I mean, there are times PLS really is the right tool to use. And I've been frustrated at times where PLS was the right tool to use, but I was pushed into using covariance-based SEM because of preferences of the editor. Again, that's a battle I'm not going to fight. I want the paper published. I'm not going to stand on, I'll say my soapboxes for editorials where no one has to decide. I get to pick what I write. So sometimes you play the game and you do what you have to do to get the paper published. And so, I will, rerun the analysis using a different method if that's what I need to do, if they feel like that is really the better method rather than just arguing for PLS. So if you can leverage both tools, that's where you put yourself in the best position. If you've decided the only tool I'm going to use is PLS, you limit your publication opportunities, and that just kind of harms yourself in the long run.
Right. Now, just to finish the last question, I guess everybody else has many questions now at this point, but by the way, Alex, we have until 6 o'clock. Is that correct?
Yeah. We have time, and we actually have several questions there that people posed through the Mentimeter that Flavio is going to make available to you so that you see and moderate them.
Okay. All right then. So the last question is this: given that you're using,
so it's the last question from Valter. It's
sorry, Stacie, I'm very sorry for that.
No, you're good.
But again, going back to this paper by Edwards, he was advocating the usage of actually mimic models instead of formative constructs. And what do you think about this? Like, if we have some type of construct, because if you're developing your own construct, you can easily add a couple of questions that will be used as indicators for the reflective indicators for the construct. Would this be okay for you? Do you see anything bad about this strategy?
Yeah, so I've actually written a paper on this topic about using mimic models. It's not widely known because it's in the Pacific Asia Journal of Information Systems. So a shout out to that particular journal if you are not familiar with it. But in that study, we used mimic models and we ran some simulations to kind of look at how well mimic models hold up in papers and in terms of in terms of models themselves. And mimic models are great because it does a couple of things for you. One is you solve the identification problem within covariance-based SEM, which is a huge issue and can have major implications on how you develop your research model. So you're no longer constrained on how you develop your structural model if you use a mimic model. It also makes the formative construct more stable. So the formative portion of the construct is less likely to change or get altered if you move it from model to model or move it within the model itself. So it becomes a much more stable model when you include mimic models. So for those reasons, I'm a huge advocate of them. The downside is you may not have reviewers that are as knowledgeable about mimic models. So you might have to do some of that education that Detmar and Arun were doing that frustrated them enough to suggest we write this paper. But maybe it'll inspire you to write your own paper about mimic models and be wildly successful at the same time. So I think mimic models can be a great tool. The challenge I think you get is making sure you have an audience that understands them.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you very much for your patience with all these questions that I had. And let's go ahead and take a look at the questions from the audience. So the first one is, in your paper, you say that the validation procedures and statistical tests for checking the validity of reflexive measures have been better established. Do you think that this is a reason why so many studies just treat any construct as reflexive?
That's a great question. I think there's a lot of inertia that happens within research. And so what we've always done, we continue to do. And so if we're using, we've been using reflective measures since the 50s. So we're pretty comfortable with using these types of techniques. And if that's what we know, we sometimes don't realize there's another option like formative constructs that are out there. And they're very comfortable. There's a lot of clear-cut guidelines. So we know we need Cronbach's alpha to be greater than 0.7. We know if our loadings are less than 0.707, we throw the item out, we run it again. I mean, we have these great established rules, which make it pretty standard in terms of, we follow it like a recipe in terms of how to run reflective measures and how to evaluate and validate these measures. With formative, there's so much more subjectivity and thought that has to go into it, and we don't have the same precision of guidelines because we haven't done it enough to get that strong, robust guidelines around it. So absolutely, I do think because there's kind of more knowledge and understanding about how to treat reflective measures, it's easy to gravitate towards using them.
Thank you. The second question is, if a construct can be both reflective or formative, and it is classified as reflective, is it misspecified? You mentioned, for instance, in your study that you had mixed measure models.
So I would say that I'm going to kind of put some caveats on that particular question. So if a construct has some reflective questions and some formative items and some reflective items, then ideally it would be modeled as a mimic construct where we'd have that multiple indicator, multiple causes model that we saw where there's, like in the picture I had, there were 3 formative items and 2 reflective items. But if that construct, if it has both formative items and reflective items and it's only modeled as reflective or it's only modeled as formative, I would argue it's probably a bad construct. Like it is misspecified because it's not misspecified or it's not specified properly as it's actually written and theoretically considered. So we typically don't have a construct with the same items that can be both reflective or formative, because if you remember those 4 decision rules I gave you, a lot of those answers are mutually exclusive. You can't both define and be a manifestation of a construct at the same time. So usually a construct is more one than the other. So and if it's, or it's just a poorly measured construct.
Okay, this one is really interesting. How did the scientific community react with the paper, with your paper, especially people that would have papers refused by those that espouse the reflective constructs only?
Yeah, so as I mentioned early on, right, this was a paper I wrote as a doctoral student. It was published in 2007 and I graduated in 2006. So in kind of 1 year after graduating, I was fortunate enough to have this paper be published. And it was pretty interesting. I remember the first time I heard myself cited at a conference, like that was pretty exciting when people were talking about Petter et al. I also remember the first time people misquoted me. That was interesting. I'm sitting in a room and the presenter was saying, Petter et al. Says that this is true of formative constructs. And I'm thinking, I'm Petter and I don't say that. So that was interesting. I also had multiple people come up to me, especially doctoral students or people who just graduated, saying, my dissertation was more difficult because of you. But then I also think the dissertation was easier because of you. So I did get some of those, I did get pushback at times about my research. I think luckily I was no one in the field at that time, right? I'm a fresh graduate from Georgia State University. Detmar and Arun, they were the big names on the paper. They were gracious enough to let me be first author since I did all of this work for the paper. So they probably heard a little bit more than I did, but I certainly did get some pushback at times from people. And there was actually a follow-up series of papers. George Maracas and Miguel Aguirre-Herrera, they wrote a paper suggesting that some of the simulation techniques that we did suggested, they came to different conclusions. They suggested that misspecification is not that much of a problem within the field. And so I had to write a rejoinder to kind of explain why we still thought it was a problem. So there was some pushback on this issue for sure.
Should be hard for a person like a younger faculty, I mean, right out of PhD, getting all this attention. This should be quite hard, you can understand. There's one question here, two questions that I'd like to defer for a little while. Can you move on to the next slide, please? Is this the only one? Oh, there's only one question. What are the major limitations and challenges when using formative constructs in my research? Is there, can I rephrase this? Is there like one big advice that you would give? I think you already gave, said avoid them, but anyway, is there anything else like that should we take home from
yeah, I would say if you're going to use formative measurement, and like I said, there's a time and a place. So if that's the route you want to go, I would say, you know, be prepared to really do some additional thinking about the constructs itself. And content validity, I would say, is by and far the really important issue. Because if you're going to say that this construct is a composite or is defined by these items, making sure you have a really good understanding of everything that needs to be included. And this is just kind of quantitative research 101. You know, we've all done that study where we're like, oh, if only I'd asked one more set of questions or one more item, and that would have really like rounded out this study. You know, you don't want to miss that whenever you're defining a formative construct. So really take the time to make sure that you've really captured the full domain of the construct, both in your definition and in the items itself. And so that's what I would say. If you're going to use it, take the time to spend a lot of time on content validity, more time than you would spend on a traditional study that you're using reflective constructs.
Okay. There's one question here about interchangeability, but I guess you were talking about the reflective constructs, not the formative constructs, right? It says, the question is, can you remove items without changing the formative construct?
So you cannot. If you remove an item from a formative construct, you've now changed the composition of the construct. So just like if you were to use a regression equation, if we just think of plain old vanilla regression, you know, we're not doing structural equation modeling, we're not doing anything kind of, you know, just if we're doing straight regression, if we remove, if we no longer want an independent variable in a multiple regression equation, we can't just delete the item, we have to run it again because it's going to change all the coefficients. And that's what's happening with a formative measurement. So we remove an item, then we're going to now change all the weights of everything else that defines that construct. And now the thing that we've thrown out no longer defines that construct. We're missing something that we had before. And there are times when maybe that's okay and we're comfortable with that because of the way we've defined the construct. But I think you have to have a lot more clarity about how you're defining the construct and what it is that you're trying to measure. And we don't have to worry about this with reflective measures, but we do with formative measures. So there was an article written a couple of years after us in MIS Quarterly by Ron Savatelli and Jeanette and Basilier, and they explained kind of how to deal with removing formative measurements and dealing with the validation of formative measurement. So I'd highly recommend that article if you kind of want to dig in a little bit deeper and use formative measurement.
And this question here asks a little bit of clarification on the relationship between, I guess, structural equation modeling and regression analysis. Can you give us like a 2 or 3 kind of little pieces of information?
Yeah, so yeah, it can get kind of confusing since I showed some things that look like regression equations while we're also talking about structural equation modeling. So kind of the simplest way that I explain it is that with structural equation modeling, it's like we're doing simultaneous regression equations. We can have a large number of regression equations that we're analyzing and identifying all of these coefficients all at once. So not only within the measurement model, but also in the structural model itself. And so often if we just focus, let's say we just focus on the structural model, and let's assume we only had one item per construct, then we can think about pretty easily how to use regression in that particular context. Because we have one item per construct, that makes it pretty simple to use. Now, if we have multiple dependent variables, that gets a bit complicated, or if we have mediating variables, that gets a bit more complicated, where you have to do blocks of regression. But when we incorporate structural equation modeling, we no longer have to do that blocking. We can have multiple dependent variables, we can have mediating variables, we can have all these different structural relationships. And at the same time, we can evaluate the measurement models themselves, which are all like mini regression equations associated with the structural model regression equations. And so it's just a way with any type of structural equation modeling. PLS works a little bit different than covariance-based SEM in terms of how it generates these estimates. But it's essentially, PLS is the closest to regression. So let's talk about PLS. PLS is basically doing a lot of simultaneous regression equations and solving those in order to get to the results themselves. So there's relationships regardless of whether you're using covariance-based SEM and components-based SEM with regression in terms of how we can understand constructs, but it's closest to PLS, right? When you're using PLS, it's very similar to how regression is being performed.
Thank you. The last question we have here is, it's interesting. It talks about the relationship between, for instance, quantitative research and formative constructs in particular, and qualitative research, categories and the codes that you use in creating qualitative research. Do you see a kind of, I wouldn't say direct translation between the two types of analysis, or what do you think?
I think this is a really interesting question. And one of my, I love research methods. I came from a doctoral program that just really emphasized research methods. So I love qualitative methods, I love quantitative methods, I love design science, right? I haven't really met many research methods I don't like. And so I think there's so much potential where we could integrate, especially qualitative and quantitative methods. And so I would say that if you're doing a qualitative study, that can often be a way to understand what those either dimensions are or those different items that could exist within a formative construct. So I mentioned we can do lit reviews and Q sorts to establish content validity, but qualitative research could certainly be a way to help establish how do we need to define the construct, understanding, you know, if we're measuring organizational performance, well, we need to understand how the organization is perceiving organizational performance, and they might help us through a set of interviews and qualitative research as we develop those codes. That might help us identify how we could create measures for formative measurement. So I think these two things could certainly go hand in hand in terms of how we could use qualitative research to inform formative measurement. Now, if we did it the other way around, which is what I think this question is really getting at, can we use formative constructs to help us analyze qualitative research? Yeah, I mean, I hadn't really thought about it in that direction before, so that's part of what makes this really kind of an interesting question. It could certainly serve as kind of themes to help guide, you know, where you're looking and the themes that you're looking for within the data. And I would say the main thing is just make sure you're open to any new possibilities as well, right? Because there might be something that emerges from the qualitative data that wasn't part of how someone specified a formative construct originally.
Thank you very much, Stacie, for sharing your knowledge, your experience, or insights with us. I'm not sure if we have any more questions. Are there any other questions right now?
Well, I have something that I have to say here. I think, Stacie, I was here monitoring the number of people that we had in our call. We at some stage we had 64. I think that was the maximum. Well, when we're talking about quantitative methods, I can tell you that we already scared some of our audience, and you did great because you didn't lose much people in the middle of the way. Right? We're still 55 brave people in the call. Some probably understand some of what you said. Some understand a lot. I've seen a few professors around here that some understand a lot, and we're just checking if what they're doing is aligned with your thoughts in the paper and everything. And some of the students made it that we have several. In fact, the majority are master's students still. They're probably thinking, gee, I still have a lot to learn. But it's great because they've been here for the whole time. And what we usually try to do at the end, we're not very coordinated at pressing print screen, but we ask people to open their cameras so that we have a final picture. And of course, as these 55 people that are, well, some of them are opening their cameras now, have other colleagues that are also interested in theory, that are also interested in methods. I would invite you to, as you also take your print screens here, show that in your social networks. It's full of other students, right? And other professors. Show it there and ask them to come and be with us next week when we will still discussing quantitative methods. We'll have Ned Koch. Well, Ned Koch is going to talk about formative constructs from using PLS that Stacie was telling you. Yeah, seems to be the easy way to go, right? He will be talking about those. Ned Koch is also a professor in an American university, Texas A&M University right now, but he is a Brazilian. So if any of you have any questions that you can only ask in Portuguese, you're allowed to do after we finish, right? So, having done that, Who else has a camera? Open your cameras there because we want to try and synchronize our print screens here. Thank you very much, Stacie. Thank you very much, Valter. It's great to have people that can pose good questions and also people that can give us enlightening answers that can make our research easier in the future, right? It's just us, the ones that have a camera. Come on. Also, let's do the print screen. All right, from my end here, all done. See you next week. Again, thank you very much, Stacie. Thank you very much, Flavio, Valter, all of the professors that were around, students from all over the place. I've seen people there from Uruguay, Peru, at least the ones that I know, Uruguay, Peru. I think there was someone from Mexico, and there are some other people that I don't know where they're from, but you're all very welcome, always.
Thank you, Stacie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alex and Flavio. Thank you, everybody else.
You who are already around, we are here doing our small talk just because we're waiting for people to arrive, right? We know that we're waiting for at least another 30 or 40 people in the next 2 minutes or so.
That we have 35 people here in the room. I thought it was just the 4 of us. I'm sorry.
No, everyone is there. I mean, the party is, they're only a little shyer. Sometimes if anyone wants to pop up and say hi there. But you know, another thing that is interesting about the pandemic, we, for whatever reason, people hate cameras, right? It's very difficult to get the students in the cameras. Of course, sometimes it's a technology issue, but sometimes I just see, I tell them, I want to see your eyes so that I know that you're there. Man, we are definitely monotask. We try to do it, be at 2 places at the same time, and you just pretend that you are in both, and you are in none of them.
Right, exactly.
I have to develop this multitasking capability. I can't do this. I'm terrible at multitasking.
I don't know if this is a stereotype, but my wife is great at it, and I'm horrible. So we both just reinforce the stereotype. Today I'm advertising Berkeley. It was the largest glass that I could get in the house because it's so hot here in Curitiba.
It is hot there?
It is amazingly hot.
It's not bad here in Rio. It's not. I thought it actually.
Well,
was,
I mean, well, I would say probably about 30 degrees Celsius. Stacie, for you, it would be something like 70s plus, almost,
right.
75 maybe or something. Pretty warm.
That's a lot for Curitiba, right?
I know, but Curitiba is a crazy place. It's always doing the opposite of what people would expect.
At least in São Paulo, we know that we're gonna have the 4 seasons of the year in one day. So in the beginning of the morning, it was raining a little bit. Now it's pretty sunny, and I'm quite sure that at the end of the day, we're gonna have a little bit of like cold or even like a freezy weather, and also maybe like a little bit of rain again. So São Paulo is like this every day, all over the year. So it's crazy.
Better than being baked in an oven here in Rio. Feels like if you're slowly getting to the point where you'll be served in dinner or something like that. How much 50 degrees would be in Fahrenheit? 50 would be what?
Well, it would be 100 and something. I don't know.
I forgot how to convert.
105. I'm just taking a guess because I never do the calculations. I just
Last summer we had.
It would be very hot even for Arizona.
I remember one day in a few years ago, probably like less than 5 years ago, when Rio was the hottest place in the world, even hotter than the Sahara Desert. It was just like